Welcome to Atheist Witch, a podcast for witches or any curious minds to learn more about a non-theistic approach to witchcraft. I'm sharing my journey as I find my way between actively practicing witchcraft and navigating a non-theistic viewpoint. I will never present my or others' opinion as fact, and any positions represented in this podcast will be referenced accordingly. Please keep in mind that just like yours, my practice is ever evolving, and my stance may change over the course of this podcast. I'm always happy to discuss this or answer any questions. Please reach out to me on social media or email. Hello, and welcome to episode 5 of the Atheist Witch podcast, History of Witchcraft. In this episode, I'll discuss the long history of pagan religions, periods of oppression throughout time, the witch wound, folk magic, and the rise of modern witchcraft, all from the perspective of an atheist witch. Before we dive in, a quick note about my Western perspective and Celtic focus. My practice has always gravitated toward Celtic traditions for a number of reasons, including my own heritage. And as I've mentioned before, this is slightly influenced by Hinduism, and I'll discuss that more in a moment. But by and large, my relative experience and expertise is heavily Western-leaning. I will do my best to represent a global perspective in this episode, and I beg your patience as I discuss some topics with which I'm less familiar. As always, I'm open to your feedback, and I invite you to comment or reach out to me via email or social media. This might be an unusual stance, but I don't feel it's fully necessary for a new or emerging witch to dive too deeply into the history that I'm going to talk about today. As unpopular as this statement will be, none of our modern pagan and neo-pagan religions are truly akin to these ancient religions. It's nearly impossible because our lives and our societies have evolved far beyond the base requirements that gave rise to these religions to begin with. There is no singular old religion for which to plumb the depths and find all the secrets of the universe. What we have today are modern practices with old roots and ancient inspirations, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's a beautiful thing for modern witches to explore and learn everything from ancient history to modern science, and create for themselves a unique and fulfilling practice, to each their own. I will also note now that this episode will delve deeply into religious history in order to explain the origins and evolution of witchcraft. I want to make the distinction that, as I've stated before, I observe a clear delineation between deific religious faith and my witchcraft practice. However, this was not as true for ancient humans, and it would do us a disservice to look past the role of ancient religions and their evolution into the world religions of today. In a future episode, I'm looking forward to diving deeper into the concept of religious faith itself and why so many humans remain drawn to the concept of deity. But I will sidestep that conversation for now and simply acknowledge the role of religion in the history of witchcraft. Humanity has maintained religious practices since the dawn of time, if our study of prehistoric humans is correct. Of course, in this context, when I say religion, I'm referring to ancient mystical and spiritual practices so different from modern religions as to be nearly an entirely different concept. These primal humans were the first pagans, of course, but were still different from our concept of other pagan religions such as Hellenism or some of the Nordic faiths. A key aspect of these prehistoric religions is the innate requirement that they be an oral tradition. Predating writing, these traditions were passed from generation to generation through storytelling and recitation. Imagine a family group gathering around the hearth and sharing stories of history and mystery, with wide-eyed children drinking in every word and memorizing it for the next generation. Ancient primal religions were ingrained into human society, whereby practitioners, shamans, and all members of the community lived inside the world of their tradition, in terms of time and place. For example, one of these stories, instead of being shared as a past tense or something that happened in another time or place, were framed as if the story was there, right now, or always happening around them with no separation between themselves and the spiritual world of their mythos. Now, as communities evolved and grew, we see that these primal religions often developed to form part of the community structure, used to teach lessons and form a sense of morality around which a human group could function. Religions were an anchor point for concepts such as virtue and ethics, a concept that we'll discuss again when we talk about religion in the abstract. Ancient religions were often upheld or maintained in practice by a mystic, a shaman, or a wise one in the community. Shamanism is regarded as one of the world's oldest discovered religions. It's featured in Paleolithic art. Shamans and wise ones were the connection between the community and the spiritual world surrounding them. Shamanism in particular is pretty fascinating in its migration from its apparent origins in the Indus Valley all throughout Asia and into Siberia, where we can see various evolutions of the word shaman in many branches of Euro-Asiatic cultures. What I always come back to when I learn or think about these ancient peoples is the role of the wise man or wise woman in the whole of human history. Over time, the separation of the clergy and the laity created a gap between the community and their spiritual leaders. However, we will see that in that vacuum, others became gathering points for communities in the way of healers and similar folk. I've mentioned in previous episodes how fascinating I find the migration of ancient religion from the Indus Valley all the way into Western Europe. Much of this is evident in the linguistic origins of the Indo-European languages, including most languages spoken in Europe, Iran, and northern India. As the original Indo-European language evolved into dialects as people moved across the earth, these dialects became the ancestors of the main European and northern Indian language groups, including the Romance languages, Germanic, and Slavic. We can still find relative commonalities in these languages, like the distinction of noun and verb, and decimal numeration, or the base numbers of 1 through 10. In fact, the sounds for numbers 1 through 10 still have a similar sound value across these languages, which all point to a common origin. Okay, so why am I taking a side trip through college linguistics? Because by the time the Celtic dialect of Indo-European emerged around 2000 BC, the Celts were already developing into a distinct cultural group around the headwaters of the Danube, the Rhine, and the Rhone rivers. In fact, these three rivers retain their Celtic origins in their names. The Danube was named for the Celtic goddess Danu, meaning divine waters. The Rhone was originally named Rhodanus, also named for the goddess Danu, and prefixed with the Celtic ro, meaning great. And the Rhine, originally called Rhenus, is the Celtic term for seaway. The reason this linguistic evolution is fascinating is because, as a result, we find a number of similarities between Sanskrit and the ancient Celtic language, including one particularly interesting example. The root word vid appears in the Celtic word for druid, as well as the Sanskrit word vida. Without going too far down the rabbit hole in this particular episode, tying these two exact words together over space and time indicates a shared root and a parallel development of religious practice between ancient Celts and the most ancient Hindu scriptures. The Celtic cultures expanded across much of Europe, smelting iron in the first millennium BC and using their tools, arms, and armor to help them venture into the forests of northern Europe and begin an agricultural society. Expanding south brought the Celts into conflict with the Etruscan Empire and eventually Rome itself. One Celtic group actually marched on Rome and held it for 7 months until the Roman Senate paid a ransom to free the city. And 100 years later, the Celts defeated the combined armies of Greece and Thermopylae and sacked the holy shrine at Delphi. By the 3rd century BC, the Celtic peoples had reached their greatest range of expansion. This did begin to shift in the 1st century BC as the military might of the Roman Empire began to push them back, as well as the expansion of the Slavic and Germanic peoples, until finally the Celtic civilization was limited to the northwest corner of Europe. Many of these points in Celtic history actually feature in the mythos and stories of the Celtic pantheon and their endless battles with the strange Fomori. The origins of many pagan and neo-pagan traditions arise from ancient and classical religions and mythologies, like Egyptian, Nordic, Greek, and Roman, some of the most popular. The ancient religion of Egypt was closely tied to Egyptian society for millennia, evolving alongside a rich and complex culture. A defining feature of this religion was the concept of the king as a conduit between the people and the divine. inspiring the great monuments that we study today with great interest. The vast history of this ancient empire actually saw the development of a monotheistic faith, which replaced the traditional pantheon at the behest of the pharaoh Akhenaten, who established a new cult dedicated to the sun. This is a particularly salient point on the definition of pagan religions not being limited to polytheistic traditions, as the cult of Amun was most certainly pagan. Ancient Egypt had a great degree of influence on other world cultures at the time, including those of Greece and Rome, with notable parallels between all three pantheons. Greek religion as a developed belief system lasted about 1,000 years, centered around ritual and sacrifice to the gods and compulsory piety. Greek mythology heavily influenced the development of the Roman pantheon. Roman religion, however, differed slightly from its forebears, with an eventual focus on the performance of ritual rather than on any moral element. Ancient Roman religion went through many periods of development, evolving eventually into an imperial cult by which the people basically worshipped the might of Rome herself, and eventually venerating the emperors themselves to near godhood. After a time, philosophers gave shape to the conception that the universe is governed by a single force, and the concept of humans as gods started to lose relevance. By the year 312 BCE, Christianity had prevailed in the Roman world, and eventually the Emperor Constantine made it the official religion of the empire. The Nordic gods were originally worshipped during the Viking Age of Northern Europe, and perhaps as early as the Iron Age. This pantheistic religion was the last pagan faith in Scandinavia, with Vikings often in conflict with followers of monotheistic faiths such as Christianity or Islam. Worship of the old Nordic pantheon decreased with the baptism of the Viking kings, and in 1103 Denmark was granted its first archbishop. A point of contention for many witches, myself included, is the Christianization of ancient faiths into pseudo-Christian concepts, with the apparent goal of closing the gap for the common people, so that the Christian faith could expand to the ends of the earth. I'll save the history and development of Christianity in detail for a possible future episode. However, the important part of the story is that after the death and resurrection of Christ, the apostles and early disciples began proclaiming the gospel, attracting converts, and establishing the early Christian church. Expansion increased after Constantine issued the Edict of Milan in 313 AD and granted religious freedom to Christians. Politics had as much to do with the Christianization of ancient religions as faith. The rise of the Holy Roman Empire in Europe saw leaders converting to Christianity to avoid conflict with this and other powerful civilizations. However, the true impetus of the spread of Christianity was in converting the masses, not the leaders. During the Middle Ages, missionaries ventured into pagan territories, preaching the gospel and establishing Christian bastions. Although incidents of forced conversion did occur, this was not the primary method by which Christianity spread. Instead, missionaries manufactured a need that had never been proclaimed before, that rewards and punishment for faith would be distributed not only in this lifetime, but for all time. Everlasting bliss or torment fomented a need for salvation, and then they met this need by offering Jesus. Christianity was also exclusive. To become a Christian meant the abandonment of all forms of paganism. As a result, many ancient pagan holy places and artwork were converted to Christian use, and pagan beliefs and motifs were purposely not recorded, or were changed to fit the Christian ideology. Thus, pagan religions became absorbed and erased in the expansion of this new religion. I would be remiss if I didn't touch on the role of indigenous traditions in a modern context. For those of us in North America, the Native or First Nations ways of life may have influenced our modern witchcraft, and the same can be said for other parts of the world, including the indigenous peoples of Oceania, Africa, and Asia. In most indigenous worldviews, instead of a separation between humans and the divine, or the duality of the sacred and the profane, there is only belonging, and there is only sacredness. This might remind you of the ancient prehistoric religions that we were speaking about in the early part of the episode. This is a deep and sensitive topic, so I will limit my commentary to my experience with the traditions of North American indigenous peoples. For those of us who feel a deep connection with the land, but perhaps are quite far from the lands of our ancestors, it can be helpful to look with deep respect to the traditions of the peoples who have walked this part of the earth for millennia. One of the deepest and most meaningful spiritual experiences of my life was when I was invited to a ceremony by the Tongva people in Long Beach, California, at their sacred site of Puvunga. However, I would discourage any witch from taking directly from any of these traditions and calling it witchcraft. I implore anyone who wishes to learn more about any indigenous traditions to approach it with discretion and very sincere respect. Let me make a quick comment on this. If you've spent any time at all in online witchcraft forums of any kind, you've no doubt seen otherwise harmless discourse devolve into vicious criticism of others on the role of things like white sage or palo santo in smoke cleansing rituals or ceremonies, or perhaps the use of an egg for la limpia de huevo. These are examples of what could potentially be considered a closed practice, or a tradition belonging to a specific group of people, whereby if one were to partake in the tradition without being an inducted member of the group, would be quite offensive and potentially even harmful to an often underrepresented population. In the case of white sage, for example, there is a valid concern that overuse by the masses is making it hard for the traditional users of the plant to acquire it for their own religious ceremonies. My advice is to always consider the origins of any part of your practice and approach it with respect. If a ritual or ceremony is suggested to you by rote, take a moment to research it before you dive right in. And of course, always look for ethical sources for all of your materials. All right, let's jump into yet another sensitive topic. Coming up next, I'm going to discuss what many modern witches colloquially refer to as the burning times, as well as the witch trials in Salem, Massachusetts. This is a trigger warning for religious violence and for violence against women. In the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance in Europe, a group of institutions within the Catholic Church sought to combat heresy among the people. The Inquisition began in 12th century France with the pursuit of heretical groups. Inquisitors sent by the Church would arrive in a village or town to root out heretics, and punishments ranged from whipping to torture and execution. There were evolutions of various inquisitions, including the Spanish Inquisition and the Roman Inquisition, but the common thread was usually the persecution of a specific group of people, like Jews or Lutherans. Although both men and women were subjected, 3/4 of those accused and executed were women. Another commonly espoused target of the Church during this time were witches, and witch trials were a common tactic of the Inquisition and other similar events in European history. Witchcraft at this time was firmly linked to heresy. It was viewed as a deed and not just an intellectual crime, and fear of diabolical witches was prevalent in the common folk. Witchcraft in this context was inherently linked to demonic possession and contracts with the devil for nefarious purposes. During the height of a witch frenzy in Germany, 2 men wrote a book called the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of the Witches. The purpose of the book was to refute any arguments that witchcraft did not exist, to prove that witches were more often women than men, and to outline procedures for detecting a witch. The hammer illustrated methods by which witches would practice their evil ways, roasting their firstborn male child, making formal pacts with the devil, depriving men of their vital member, and much more. One of the supposed dead giveaways of a witch was the witch's mark, or stigma diabolicum, which was some kind of skin lesion, mole, or wart that clearly indicated a deal with the devil. The height of witch hunting in early modern Europe occurred first in the 15th and early 16th centuries, and then again in the 17th century. Criminal law in the Holy Roman Empire dictated that the accused could be secretly interrogated, denied counsel, required the use of torture to extract a confession, and then specified that witches should be punished with death by burning. The European witch trials arose from a complex combination of social change and religious oppression. It's estimated that a total of 30,000 to 60,000 people were executed in the main era of these witchcraft persecutions. The Salem witch trials are perhaps the most famous in history. Like many before it, this witch trial sought to place blame onto the shoulders of witches, communing with the devil, for the negative events such as smallpox and fear of attack by nearby native tribes. Events in Salem started with accusations of witchcraft flung by a group of young girls, and was whipped into a frenzy with a special court instituted in 1692 to hold trial. A total of 141 suspects were tried as witches, and by the end, 20 people had been executed. Apologies and restitutions have been made to the families of the victims, but the Salem trials remain a deeply disturbing moment in American history. Witch trials are not limited to European and American history, and in some places in the world they even continue on into modern day. Witches are the frequent point of blame for misfortune in the community. In recent years, witchcraft has been blamed for the HIV/AIDS epidemic in Africa. In India, landowning women are sometimes accused of witchcraft and frightened from their homes for the purpose of taking their property. Although I plan to discuss this more in a future episode, I'd like to take a moment to mention the witch wound. Many witches believe that the witch wound is an inherited collective trauma resulting from the terrible history of the Burning Times and other periods of persecution throughout history, and that it manifests in modern witches as a hindrance to their personal power, particularly for female witches. Researchers do not agree on whether those executed in the Burning Times were solely women on the outskirts of society. Some argue that it began that way, but over time, married and well-established individuals were more commonly accused, and some point out that in certain countries, men were even the slight majority of the accused. Some acknowledge the prevalence of healers and midwives among the accused. Others point out that there is evidence that midwives were more likely to work with the accusers to help identify witch marks. What I can assure you is that the people who were executed were innocent. They were also not likely goddess-worshipping witches in hiding, or at least no evidence exists to suggest such. These were ordinary people living in a difficult period of time who fell victim to the worst parts of humanity. However, what is absolutely undeniable is the systemic oppression of women throughout history. When I think of the witch wound, what comes to mind are the religious and social constructs that have truly silenced women's voices and hindered female power, especially at the hands of other women. Believe me when I say I have big feelings about this, and we will talk more about the witch wound in another episode. Despite the terrible events of the witch trials and the fear of religious persecution, people such as healers, midwives, folk practitioners, wise men and women, and cunning folk have practiced for centuries, some as active members of mainstream religions. The traditional approach taken by these practitioners throughout history has contributed greatly to the development of modern medicine. An interesting example of this is flying ointment, an ointment that's been made for centuries from the thorn apple, which contains a pharmacologically active compound called hyoscine. Hyoscine is a local anesthetic which, at high doses, can cause delirium and hallucinations, hence the name of the resulting ointment. Today, this compound is used in conventional medicine as a treatment for motion sickness and can help with nausea and stomach cramps. Of course, I need to provide a disclaimer per usual. Although some claim that witches or similar folk were the first to plumb the medical mysteries of the human body, while so-called doctors and surgeons were relying on foolishness like alchemy and humors, this is unfortunately an oversimplification of history, and it doesn't quite stand up to scrutiny. Folk magic is still practiced today in various communities around the world. Some of the more well-known traditions are Appalachian folk magic, Italian strigheria, and hoodoo, although there are far too many others to list. Folk magic is not quite a religion on its own, and although many witches are influenced by folk magic, practitioners do not necessarily refer to themselves as witches. In more recent history, we have the development of the largest modern or neo-pagan religion, Wicca. Wicca was first identified as such by Gerald Gardner in 1950s England, although its development was influenced by a number of other occultists, including Margaret Murray and Aleister Crowley. Margaret Murray, an English Egyptologist and author, hypothesized the existence of an ancient, secretive witch cult of magical practitioners surviving throughout history, including the witch trials, who worshipped a god named Janus. Murray's ideas were pervasive, and even went as far as publication in the Encyclopedia Britannica. Unfortunately, most of Murray's claims were spurious at best and criticized heavily both by her contemporaries and modern researchers. Gardner, however, took Murray's ideas quite seriously and used them as a basis for developing Wicca. He claimed he had been initiated into a coven of this witch cult and went on to establish a coven of his own in order to prevent the tradition from dying out. Gardner's initial approach was also based heavily on the writings of occultist Aleister Crowley, using Crowley's rituals to fill in any gaps left by the traditions of the witch cult. Gardner's vision for the coven was also influenced by a coven member and eventual high priestess named Doreen Valiente, who helped shift the coven's practice from solely worshipping the horned god, or Janus, to emphasize the role of the goddess. The first American coven was established in 1963 by Raymond Buckland. Ray was a prolific writer, and many of his books are still considered staples to witchcraft practitioners today. Wicca has been growing steadily, especially in English-speaking Western countries, and a number of offshoot traditions have formed from the initial Gardnerian Wicca. The original concept of the ancient witch cult has become largely considered a creation myth rather than rote history, and the religion continues to develop in covens and solitary practitioners around the world. It's arguable that the growth of Wicca as a religion is largely responsible for the greater visibility and interest in other pagan religions and practices. I would suggest that modern witchcraft as we know it has been evolved and influenced by all of the people, traditions, and events that I've discussed. It seems only appropriate that it continues to evolve, and we can see some of this influence and evolution happening even in our own lifetimes. Portrayals of Wicca and witchcraft in the media, such as Charmed, The Craft, and Practical Magic, have inspired greater interest in recent generations. This has only continued with the advent of internet resources, forums, and chat rooms, and today we can see the sometimes unfortunate impact of modern social media like witch talk. The internet has made witchcraft and other pagan traditions far more accessible to groups and individuals who otherwise would have been blocked from that information. It's connected practitioners together to share thoughts and ideas, and as a result, we're seeing interest in witchcraft explode and evolve at a rapid pace. Although this episode is titled History of Witchcraft, it isn't intended purely as a history lesson, but more as a commentary on the interconnectedness of various religions throughout history and the evolution of the pagan practices we see today, as well as the common human predisposition to seek the divine. Now, as an atheist witch, the study of religious history helps me understand how faith and belief have shaped humanity. I believe it's important to remember how we got here in order to help discern where we should go next. Speaking of which, in the next episode, I will discuss the future of witchcraft. This is going to be a largely speculative episode that includes the impact of politics, the internet, bigotry, transgender acceptance, environmentalism, and the influence of Abrahamic religions on modern witchcraft, and how these factors may impact the next generations of practitioners. Also coming up is the second bonus episode of 2025, Ostara. Thank you for joining me today for the history of witchcraft, and I will see you next time. The best way to support this podcast is to please like, subscribe, or leave a review. Follow or message me on Insta at anatheistwitch, or email me your comments and questions at anatheistwitch@gmail.com. The Atheist Witch podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, nursing, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical advice. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from this podcast is at the user's own risk. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Users should not disregard or delay in obtaining medical advice for any medical condition they may have, and should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such conditions.